In December of 2025, a United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer entered a private discussion with members of the United States Congress and delivered a statement that, once it reached the public, created a strong political shock in Ottawa. He said the United States was not willing to renew CUSMA unless what he called specific and structural concerns were dealt with. At the top of those concerns was Canada's dairy access rules and Canadian exports tied to dairy products. Shortly after those remarks became public, Mark Carney responded at a press event. A journalist questioned him about Canada's supply management system. He replied in French, a clear and intentional decision. The setting was Quebec, the province where dairy production holds the strongest political protection nationwide. In response to what was seen as pressure from Washington, he delivered a message that left no ambiguity. In both of Canada's official languages, his position was stated in 4 words followed by firm repetition. Supply management is not negotiable, not open for compromise, not subject to adjustment, not under discussion, and not on the table. The focus then shifts to explaining what supply management actually is, why Canada created it, and why it has remained intact through every major trade negotiation since the 1970s. It also refers to legislation passed in 2025 that prevents the federal government from removing it through trade talks. Attention then turns to what the United States is seeking when it raises dairy market access issues, and why Carney's refusal to include the system in negotiations is presented as a political and legal constraint rather than a bargaining tactic. The stakes involve approximately 15,000 dairy farmers in Canada and an industry valued at around 11 billion Canadian dollars. This also connects directly to the CUSMA review process, which is now entering a critical stage. This situation is not framed simply around agricultural goods. It is described as a broader question of national control, limits of American trade pressure, and one of the most entrenched lines in Canadian trade policy that has consistently resisted change under external demands. Supply management itself is a structured production and pricing framework that has governed dairy, poultry, and egg production in Canada since the early 1970s. It operates through 3 core pillars. The first is production quotas. Farmers are issued licenses that define how much milk, chicken, turkey, or eggs they are allowed to produce based on domestic consumption needs. The second is import regulation. A system of tariff rate quotas allows limited quantities of foreign dairy and poultry products into Canada with low or zero tariffs. Anything beyond those limits faces duties exceeding 200%, effectively blocking large-scale imports from being commercially viable. The third is price setting. The Canadian Dairy Commission establishes baseline pricing for liquid milk, ensuring farmers receive payments that cover production costs, along with a stable profit margin, reducing exposure to global price swings. Economically, the system is designed to secure predictable income for Canadian producers in exchange for limiting output volumes. It also functions as a protective structure against competition from heavily subsidized United States dairy production. In the United States, the dairy sector benefits from extensive federal support programs, including price stabilization and income protection measures. According to data from the United States Department of Agriculture, these supports have reached tens of billions of dollars over the past 2 decades. American producers are often able to sell milk at lower apparent prices, partly because taxpayer-funded programs supplement farm income beyond market earnings. Canada's supply management system is positioned as a balancing mechanism. Instead of matching subsidies directly, Canada restricts market entry and controls domestic supply to stabilize its own agricultural sector. As a result, dairy products in Canada tend to be priced higher than comparable products in the United States. American dairy products are described as having limited ability to enter the Canadian market at meaningful scale. At the same time, around 15,000 Canadian dairy farming families, mainly based in Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia, are said to maintain income stability that, even with subsidy systems in place, is not consistently matched by their American counterparts. Washington's position is not framed as a rejection of Canada's supply management system itself. Instead, the United States focuses on 2 narrower and more technical concerns inside the CUSMA framework. The first concern involves how Canada manages tariff rate quotas created under CUSMA. During the 2018 CUSMA negotiations, Canada agreed to expand market access equal to about 3.5% of national dairy consumption. This access was divided across 14 separate product categories. This concession is described as a significant negotiating win for the United States. It was strongly opposed by Canada's dairy sector and required major political effort from both the Trudeau government and supply-managed producers, who had historically resisted any reduction in quota protections. The United States argues that Canada does not distribute these quotas in a way that effectively allows American products to reach Canadian buyers. The specific criticism is that Canada assigns most quota shares to domestic processors instead of directing them toward retailers and food service operators, which Washington believes would result in more direct consumer access. Another point of contention is the handling of unused quota allocations. The United States argues that Canada should more aggressively reclaim unused import rights from quota holders who do not fully use their share, in order to ensure the access granted under CUSMA is actually utilized rather than remaining inactive. The second dispute centers on Canada's pricing system for milk solids used in exports. This involves a pricing category known as Class 7, introduced in 2017. It allows Canadian processors to purchase domestically produced milk solids at prices aligned with international markets for use in export-oriented products. American industry groups argue that this system functions as a form of indirect export support that allows Canadian dairy goods to compete more aggressively in global markets, potentially placing pressure on United States suppliers abroad. The Trump administration initiated an investigation through the United States International Trade Commission, specifically examining the Class 7 pricing mechanism. Despite these disputes, the situation is not presented as a United States demand for the elimination of supply management. Reporting from the Globe and Mail indicates that Washington has not formally requested the abolition of the system or a major expansion of American quota access. Instead, the disagreements are described as legal and technical issues that could be debated within trade law frameworks. However, the way these issues are communicated politically in Washington is said to amplify their scope, making the dispute appear broader than the formal requests actually indicate. This framing has reinforced Mark Carney's firm refusal, making it not only politically defensible but also broadly supported compared to a more incremental negotiation approach over quota administration rules. A key element of the issue is described as a parliamentary restriction that transforms Carney's stance from a political choice into a legal obligation. In June of 2025, all major parties in the House of Commons, including the Conservatives under Pierre Poilievre, supported a bill that blocks inclusion of supply-managed products in future trade negotiations. This agreement included parties that traditionally support freer trade policies in Canada. The legislation passed with unanimous political backing across major factions. As a result, supply management is now protected not only by political consensus, but also by law. Carney is therefore unable to legally trade away dairy concessions as part of any broader agreement with the United States. He also cannot be politically challenged on this issue in a meaningful way, since the Conservative Party, which might otherwise provide an alternative position, has also supported the same legal restriction. Bloc leader Yves François Blanche, whose party introduced the legislation and whose base is strongly tied to supply-managed agriculture in Quebec, confirmed the existence of this legal framework. Under these conditions, Carney's December press conference response in French is presented not as symbolic messaging for Quebec audiences, but as a reflection of an established legal and political boundary. He was outlining a legal condition, not a political preference. The United States cannot place supply management on the CUSMA negotiation table because a law passed by the Parliament of Canada explicitly prevents it from being included. That changes the meaning of the position entirely. It is no longer about reluctance or resistance. It becomes a matter of legal impossibility, a constraint that holds even if there was willingness on both sides. The economic scale of Canada's dairy industry explains much of the political structure around it. It generates roughly $11 billion in annual farm gate revenue. Around 15,000 dairy farming families depend on it. These communities are heavily concentrated in key electoral regions that shape national outcomes, including rural Quebec, eastern Ontario, and British Columbia's Fraser Valley. Supply-managed agriculture, covering dairy, poultry, and eggs, represents the most capital-intensive segment of Canadian farming. Investments in infrastructure, equipment, and production rights are built specifically around the system's design. A farmer who purchases a milk quota valued at $500,000 is essentially buying the right to produce a fixed annual volume, under the expectation that the system will protect that investment across a 40-year financing horizon. If that structure were removed and replaced with open competition against lower-priced, subsidized American dairy imports, many producers would not be able to absorb the shock and would face financial collapse. The wider impact of dismantling supply management without compensation would extend beyond individual farms. It would result in rural bankruptcies, generational farm closures, and the erosion of agricultural communities across Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia that have developed under this framework for 50 years. No federal government has ever accepted that political cost. No party seeking national power has ever proposed absorbing it. The legislation passed in 2025 reflects that long-standing consensus in formal legal form. At the same time, Canadian imports of American dairy under CUSMA have increased significantly since the new quota system began. In 2024, those imports reached $897 million Canadian dollars, more than 4 times the level recorded before 2020. Canada is described as having fully complied with the access commitments established in the 2018 agreement. The United States is now seeking additional access beyond those terms. The response from Canada across political lines and leaderships remains consistent. It is a refusal. The broader CUSMA review process forms the backdrop for this dispute. The July 1st, 2026 review deadline passed without a resolution. Canada's Trade Minister, LeBlanc, met with United States Trade Representative Greer on June 3rd, presenting proposals that were not disclosed publicly. Mexico has advanced further in its bilateral negotiations with Washington. The United States has assembled a list of priorities including dairy access, provincial alcohol restrictions, digital services rules, and procurement issues. These are being used as leverage points tied to broader CUSMA discussions, rather than isolated technical matters. Mark Carney responded to this approach by rejecting the idea of unilateral terms. He stated that the United States does not dictate the framework, and that negotiations are mutual. He also acknowledged that Canada has its own concerns regarding United States trade practices, framing the talks as a two-sided process with competing interests on both ends. He emphasized that any agreement must serve Canadian interests, without defining those interests in a way that would exclude existing dairy protections. In practice, this means the boundary around supply management remains intact. The gap between Washington's requested preconditions and Ottawa's acceptable starting point remains wide, particularly on dairy. It is not narrowing. Canada has a law, Carney has a fixed position, Greer holds a set of demands, and between those 3 points lies the unresolved space of one of the most significant trade negotiations between the two countries in this generation. Like, share, and subscribe for more updates. Please leave your thoughts about this content in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.